Hello, and on behalf of VMUG, I'd like to welcome you to today's webcast, What's New with VMware Cloud Foundation 4.0 on Dell EMC Vxrail 7.0, presented by Jason Marks, Senior Principal Engineer, Integrated Products and Solutions, Technical Marketing at Dell Technologies. Thank you for participating in today's webcast and for your continued support in the Global VMUG program. Before we begin, I have 3 quick housekeeping items to go over. First, today's webcast will be recorded and available for you on demand. You will receive a follow-up email with the on-demand link, so keep an eye out for that. Second, the questions section of GoToWebinar will be monitored throughout today's presentation. All questions should be entered in the questions window near the bottom of your GoToWebinar screen. Third, there will be a short online evaluation that pops up as you exit the webcast. Please take a minute and let us know what you thought of today's session and what you might like to see going forward. All live attendees who opt in at registration and complete the survey at the end of the broadcast will be entered into a raffle to win a Nintendo Switch Lite. Dell will email the winner following the webcast today, so good luck. All right, let's get started. Jason, I'll turn it over to you now.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for having me today, and welcome everyone to today's webcast. We certainly have a lot of information to cover, so I'd rather just jump right into it. And obviously, to the point here, any questions on any of the material that we review during this call, please send them through the Q&A. We have some of my colleagues here on both the Dell technology side as well as some of our friends over at VMware monitoring that to help answer your questions. If there are any outstanding questions and we have time left at the end of the presentation, we'll try to answer them verbally for you, but most of the questions and answers will happen in the chat. All right, so let's get going. So this is a high-level agenda of all of the items that are new as a part of the Cloud Foundation 4.0 on Vxrail 7.0 release. We will be covering all of this in today's presentation, so as you could probably tell, there is a lot of substance here. So let's jump into some of these. First, we're going to highlight the updated bill of material that's included in the release. So specifically, Cloud Foundation 4.0 on Vxrail 7.0 includes a subset of all of these various VMware and Dell Technologies software components. So Vxrail 7.0 is made up of Vsphere 7.0 and vSAN 7.0. We've now aligned the Vxrail version number to the version of Vsphere that is supported on that. So for those of you that may be familiar with Vxrail in prior versions of 4.7, and this being a huge jump, that's the reason for the version number change. So it's a little easier to understand what version of Vsphere is running. And then really as a part of the Cloud Foundation 4.0 portion of the bill of materials, we are now leveraging Nsxt 3.0, and that's exclusive to the entire solution release. So there is no more use of NSXV as a part of Cloud Foundation, beginning with 4.0 and above. Also included is Sddc Manager 4.0, introductory support via kind of manual guidance for Workspace ONE Access, formerly known as Identity Manager, and then updated support for the latest versions of the Vreli suite, which are based on 8.1. So we have Vreli Suite Lifecycle Manager 8.1, Vreli Automation 8.1, VROPS 8.1, and Log Insight 8.1, as well as the Network Insight 5.2, which is aligned to all of those. So let's move on and discuss some of the Cloud Foundation architecture and bring up changes, because there were a few. With the introduction of vSphere 7, there's a lot of changes that are made to the actual Cloud Foundation standardized architecture to take advantage of some of those architecture differences that exist in vSphere. In particular, we are now leveraging embedded platform services controller services inside the vCenter server appliances. So when we go and install Cloud Foundation, we are no longer deploying 2 dedicated virtual machines that are used to host platform services, controller services. Those are now embedded in the vCenter server appliances. Also, now that we are completely based on an Nsxt architecture with NSXV going away as a part of this greenfield only release, we are now adopting the Nsxt architecture. And as a part of that, you now have a set of 3 virtual machines that are deployed on our initial management cluster that runs the NSXT manager service as well as the NSX controller services. So these 2 services have been consolidated into a single 3 VM based cluster that runs on the management domain, and there's no more separate set of 3 node clusters for the NSX manager, the NSX controller portions. Also, some of the vRealize components like vRealize Log Insight are now made to be optional and deployed in a similar fashion to the rest of the vRealize suite components. Thus, when I deploy Cloud Foundation for the first time, I'm actually leveraging less physical resources in doing so because of these enhancements. Now, the last piece to highlight in this particular slide is the fact that you can also take advantage of the deployment of NSXT Edge clusters at the time of a deployment. However, it is optional, and we'll touch upon what that is a little bit later. So let's kind of talk a little bit about kind of the ramifications of leveraging the embedded PSC model. In the past, when I had dedicated PSC virtual machines to provide high availability to the PSC services, they were set up in an active-passive kind of HA pair. But now that we have PSCs embedded in every vCenter server appliance that gets deployed, not just for the management domain vCenter, but also for any of the workload domains, we can now take advantage of a much more robust and simplified high availability architecture. And we do this by leveraging a ring-based replication between all of the vCenters that are deployed in our Cloud Foundation environment. And so there's always this protection, no matter which vCenter may fail, that PSC set of data is always going to be available on any of the other vCenters that are deployed in the environment. And then finally, as it relates to Sddc Manager, Sddc Manager does authenticate to this set of platform services, and that's kind of the way that we authenticate there is to the PSC. Now, as we kind of bring together the architecture enhancements of the underlying components like NSXT as an example, it's also important to just understand how this fits into the broader Cloud Foundation standardized architecture in general. So when I deploy Cloud Foundation, I'm not only deploying all of these cool SDDC software technologies, but I'm also deploying a very standardized architecture on how these components get configured and provisioned. And that's really based on the VMware Validated Designs standardized architecture. And the automation that's provided by Sddc Manager is really that automation and implementation engine of doing this configuration and provisioning and ensuring that when doing so, it adheres to those standardized designs. So there's always kind of this, architecture that I'm kind of adopting when deploying Cloud Foundation. And so part of that architecture is leveraging a management domain, which houses all of the management software for the environment, and then workload domains, which are typically deployed to run customer applications. Now, when I deploy any of these workload domains and management domains, I have those NSX managers and the vCenters that are deployed on the management domain cluster. And then the ESX hosts that make up the clusters in my workload domains would actually run the NSXT edges for that workload domain, as well as any of the actual applications. So when I deploy any of these workload domains, as part of some of the newer features with Cloud Foundation 4.0, I have the ability to dedicate a specific Nsxt instance to that workload domain, along with that dedicated vCenter that will always be deployed with each workload domain deployment. And this is new. So in 4.0, we now have the ability to choose whether or not a customer wants to share an Nsxt instance that has been deployed across multiple workload domains for the workloads running on both of them, or I can dedicate multiple Nsxt instances to each of the workload domains that I deploy. And so you kind of see that architecture laid out in the diagram in this slide to kind of point out that you can choose some flexible deployment models of how many Nsxt managers I'd like to use, what are they managing as far as the workloads and the workload domains. I also then have choices in how I deploy my NSX Edge components. I can set up dedicated clusters in my workload domain to just run that NSX Edge traffic and then run my applications on separate physical clusters. Or I can actually just run edge services on the same physical clusters as my applications. That type of flexibility is available to you as a part of this architecture. And then one of the last kind of features that, that is available, we'll get into this a little bit later, is the support for Vsphere with Kubernetes in Cloud Foundation 4. And the way that Vsphere with Kubernetes is kind of deployed is that it is enabled on a cluster basis. And so you can have workload domains that have certain clusters in them with Vsphere with Kubernetes enabled on them. You can have other workload domains that don't. So the choice and flexibility is up to you as a Cloud Foundation or Vxrail administrator to leverage that infrastructure the way you see fit. Now, one of the important things as it relates to the management domain is in the networking. So back in Cloud Foundation 3.9, VMware has introduced a concept called application virtual networks. And really, what is AVN? Ultimately, this is a software-defined overlay network. So think of this as the NSX logical networks that you could provision out that various components, whether they be management components or application workloads, are connecting to. And so here, to help simplify kind of future Cloud Foundation architecture capabilities, especially as it relates to multi-site, DR type of configurations, the vRealize suite components can be connected to one of these NSX logical networks at the time VCF is installed. So when I install Cloud Foundation as a part of that installation automation, which is executed by the Cloud Builder utility, you can choose whether to have that automated workflow configure the NSX application logical network or application virtual network, which is really going to be staged for when you want to deploy your vRealize suite components into your environment later on. So everything on the vRealize management component side will now be connected to an overlay network, which in the case of kind of future developments will enable customers to fail over the vRealize management pieces without having to re-IP your vRealize component IP addresses into the secondary location. So this is really helping set up a lot of that network abstraction for the actual Cloud Foundation management pieces. Obviously, this type of NSX logical networking has already been available for customers who optionally want to use them for their applications. But now this is kind of being used as a part of this standardized architecture and design for the actual Cloud Foundation management. So today, it is optional for customers to turn this on at time of Cloud Foundation deployment, but it is important to know that if you want to use it, proper planning ahead of time is needed. So what does this actually look like when it gets implemented? Ultimately, there are the NSX management and edges that automatically get deployed with the NSX Tier 0 and Tier 1 routers. And there's ultimately two NSX segments that get set up on this. One for the local region, for components that don't need to be kind of stretched in multiple environments, and one that is essentially cross-region. So you look at the components in this slide with region A, components like Vrealize Log Insight will only need to be deployed locally. However, the remaining portions of the Vrealize suite, like VRops and Vrealize Automation, as well as Vrealize Suite Lifecycle Manager, these are all deployed when you choose to deploy them onto the cross-region NSX segment. So what about the Vrealize Suite support? In this case, as far as the bill of materials, Vrealize Suite 8.1 is what is now supported. As of this 4.0 release, it is deployed using manual documented guidance. So what ends up happening here is if I choose to deploy the choose to deploy the application virtual networks at the time of initial Cloud Foundation installation, I will then have the ability to leverage Sddc Manager to automate the deployment of the Vrealize Suite Lifecycle Manager 8.1. Now, after that, once the Vrealize Suite Lifecycle Manager is deployed as a part of this release, you will then use that tool and the manual guidance outlined in the VVD to deploy the remaining Vrealize Suite components as an optional day 2 operation. In the future, there are plans in future Cloud Foundation releases to enable more of an automated way to deploy the remaining Vrealize Suite components, but this is kind of the way it's handled now. When I deploy the Vrealize Lifecycle Manager, the reason I need the AVN deployed is that a part of that Sddc Manager automation is assuming that it's going to connect those components to those application virtual networks. So then when I do use the Vrealize Suite Lifecycle Manager, along with the manual guidance to deploy the remaining Vrealize Suite components, they will be deployed onto that application virtual network. Otherwise, there will be plans for manual guidance on customers that don't want to use AVN on how to deploy the Vrealize Suite Lifecycle Manager using manual VLAN back networks. Okay, let's highlight what's new in the Kubernetes workload management feature, essentially known as Vsphere with Kubernetes. With Cloud Foundation 4.0, there are support for two major workload domain types. I kind of alluded to this before. So the first is a special type of workload domain called the management domain. And this is a dedicated Nsxt-backed Vxrail cluster that is used to host the Cloud Foundation management software components. The second is the VI workload domains that are backed by Vxrail. And in this case, we kind of refer to them as Vxrail infrastructure workload domains. These are dedicated Vxrail clusters that are backed by Nsxt that allow you to pull together all of your Sddc infrastructure resources to run your applications. Now, this is where we can, for the most part, and probably more common use case, enable Vsphere with Kubernetes on these types of workload domains. And we'll touch a little bit further on with other use cases, but ultimately you would deploy a cluster and you would enable Vsphere with Kubernetes on those clusters. So it's not necessarily a feature that has a dedicated workload domain to it. It's more of a cluster feature that you turn on the clusters within a workload domain. And you have the flexibility of enabling Vsphere with Kubernetes on a subset of workload domain clusters or on all of them. That's the flexibility you have with that feature. As you can see in this particular release, there is no support for an automated Horizon workload domain or any type of Tanzu Kubernetes grid integrated or formerly known as Enterprise PKS workload domains. Horizon domains are certainly planned for future releases. Okay, So in Cloud Foundation, part of the benefit of why vSphere with Kubernetes was initially being made available through Cloud Foundation only is the fact that there are a lot of infrastructure prerequisites that need to be deployed and set up prior to being able to enable vSphere with Kubernetes on a vSphere cluster. And so part of that infrastructure is automated by Sddc Manager to help accelerate being able to deploy and enable this feature. And within Sddc Manager, some of these capabilities are done through the UI, and you'll see it listed as Kubernetes Workload Management. So this kind of kicks off the process once all of the specific infrastructure components, such as Nsxt edge devices, are deployed and set up, that I can go in and actually turn on that feature on the vSphere clusters of my choosing. And so this provides a nice way for you as a customer to have a validated process to make sure that the input data that you've set up to turn this on is accurate, and that all the prerequisites have been met prior to beginning this enablement process. And then it really just allows you then to use native vCenter wizard like you normally would, because it is a vSphere feature, to turn it on and actually go through and entering the remaining portions of what's needed. And then obviously all of the management of the vSphere with Kubernetes capabilities, like namespace management and so forth, is done through the native vCenter that is used to manage those clusters. Okay, so we'll touch a little bit more on some of that later, but I think now we'll move on to some of the updates around deployment architectures. So new to Cloud Foundation on Vxrail specifically, we have added support to be able to deploy Cloud Foundation on Vxrail using two different deployment options. We've always had the VCF standard architecture, which is really based on having that dedicated management domain and then physically separate out with different clusters the actual workload domains for your applications. What's new in this release is the support for a consolidated architecture. This allows a customer to deploy at a starting point of 4 nodes, the management domain, but then support running user applications on that same management domain infrastructure. So we're kind of sharing infrastructure resources between the Cloud Foundation management components and user applications. So this it has a benefit to it because it allows us to start our deployment with just 4 nodes versus with the standard architecture, we would start with a minimum of 7 nodes, even though 8 nodes is kind of what is recommended. So it's got that lower entry point from a footprint and also from a cost, because there are less node infrastructure components that are required for this. There are a few things though that we want to highlight in terms of, hey, where should I use one or the other at a high level on this particular slide. And it's to call out that today those applications, they are separated out using resource pools, right? You're not going to get physical resource isolation between your applications and the management components. So resource pools are what are used here for logical isolation. Also, as of today, Cloud Foundation on Vxrail does not support the ability to start with a consolidated architecture deployment and then transition that into a standard architecture. That is still pending some joint VMware and Dell Technologies engineering validation and the creation of documented guidance in order to do that. Also, we do have support in a management domain, specifically for that consolidated architecture, to enable vSphere with Kubernetes on that. However, it is not the same kind of automated process in this release as what you would find when enabling it within a workload domain. So manual guidance is still the approach to take in this particular release for using vSphere with Kubernetes in a consolidated architecture. Now with the standard architecture, you have full isolation, full physical isolation with infrastructure for your workloads. You have dedicated vCenters for all of those. different type of workload domains, your separation of Nsxt managers, and so forth and so on. And this is ultimately where we kind of support different types of workload domains. So right now in this release, it's the VI workload domain only, but certainly in future releases, this is the architecture that would be required in order to support things like Horizon workload domains. All right, those are kind of the types of things that would be planned for future releases. So this is a little bit of the architecture of the consolidated deployment. And you'll see here we have to start with a 4-node cluster that runs our Cloud Foundation management components. The vRealize pieces are optionally deployed, but those would also run here. But then you have your different resource pools that are created during the Cloud Foundation installation for the management pieces, and then you can deploy your applications into your actual workload resource pools. Here is a little bit of an overview of what the standard architecture looks like. You have your dedicated management workload domain that runs all of your management software components, and then all of your different Vxrail VI workload domains running your applications. So which one should I use, right? I think it's very important to understand that, the scalability concern is one kind of decision metric that should be factored in. But there are a lot of kind of operational differences that I think could be even more important of a consideration, as well as specific workload support that need to be considered in determining, well, which type of architecture makes the most sense. First and foremost, it's important to understand that with the consolidated architecture, you have a single vCenter and a single Nsxt manager instance that is used to manage that management domain. So your applications that are running on it will be bound to and managed by those same vCenter and Nsxt instances. So you're not going to be able to dedicate a different vCenter to manage those workloads and an Nsxt manager to manage those workloads, as you would in a standard architecture. And this becomes important because lifecycle management-wise, Cloud Foundation lifecycles all of the infrastructure based on workload domains. So if I do have specific applications that have a version dependency on the underlying infrastructure components, like a Vsphere version as an example, there may be dependencies that are misaligned to some of your applications that are running on that management domain that would cause some challenges. So you'd probably want to isolate those workloads so you have independent workload domain lifecycle management capabilities. The other is in some of the flexibility around licensing. So when I deploy a standard architecture and I have different physically separated workload domain clusters, I have the flexibility to license those clusters based on the additions of the components that align to the features I need for the workloads that I'm running on it. So I don't necessarily have to run, let's say, I have an application that requires vSAN storage encryption capabilities. Well, if only one application requires that and the rest of them don't, I still have to, pay for the highest level of the vSAN license included in the Cloud Foundation bundles that provide me that encryption service. So I'm kind of required to pay for that, even though the good majority of workloads that I'm deploying are not using it. So with standard architectures, I have that ability to break it apart, which is nice. And then finally, the workloads. The workloads, obviously with Consolidated, there is a subset of workloads that are supported: general purpose, virtual machine, server workloads, and Vsphere with Kubernetes. Horizon workloads and those types of VDI kind of deployments are not supported in that type of architecture. So if that is what you need, then standard architecture is the really decision that you have there. All right, let's talk about some networking enhancements. So with the release of Vsphere 7.0, VMware has introduced support for a consolidated virtual distributed switch that supports Nsxt. So now I no longer have a need for a dedicated NVDS for running Nsxt traffic that is separate than my VDS. I can now run Nsxt traffic as well as standard Vsphere traffic on that same virtual distributed switch. Why is this important? Well, with Cloud Foundation on Rail, for those customers that required Nsxt use, that NVDS required separate physical uplink ports that needed to be configured from a hardware point of view that could be used to connect that NVDS. And then the Vxrail traffic would run on a VDS as a part of that. So we required kind of a doubling of the minimum amount of physical ports that would be required on each host. Now, because we can run both types of traffic on the same VDS, I don't need to double the number of uplink ports. I can now leverage the same physical uplinks for all of that traffic, which means that I can start with a minimum of 2 physical ports on all of my hosts. That really minimizes the amount of physical hardware that I need to put into my environment, as well as limiting the amount of network connections to my top-of-rack switches, as well as minimizing the number of ports and number of ports I need to license on those same top-of-rack switches. So it really helps lower the cost of entry from a networking point of view with this new release. Also, some of the other networking enhancements include automation of the deployment of Nsxt edge clusters. This is both for the management domain, which is a part of that application virtual network feature that I talked about, that is done as a part of VCF installation by the Cloud Builder tool, as well as optional day 2 activity. So when I deploy a Vxrail VI workload domain, I can choose to deploy and automate that deployment of Nsxt edge clusters, leveraging the power of the Sddc manager automation in the process. Now, in this particular slide, we're kind of highlighting a little bit of what it would look like to take advantage of the flexibility of either using dedicated Nsxt instances for my workload domains, or being able to reuse an existing instance that has already been deployed in the environment for a new workload domain that I'm creating. So here within the typical wizard that would be used within Sddc Manager of adding a Vxrail cluster into a newly furnished kind of workload domain that Sddc Manager sets up for us, you will be given the choice of either creating a net new Nsxt instance when this cluster gets added to the workload domain, or just attach everything that is being deployed in here to an existing Nsxt instance. And then all of the automation that is needed, all the configuration that is needed to do that is performed and executed by Sddc Manager for you. A nice new feature that's also been added to Cloud Foundation on Vxrail environment specifically is kind of the new initial support for Cloud Foundation APIs, in particular Sddc Manager APIs. So why is this important? Well, what we want to be able to do is enable Cloud Foundation on Vxrail to be interfaced as, essentially infrastructure as code. If we really want a truly dynamic infrastructure provisioning and configuration experience that is completely programmable, we need to enable a way to interface with the cloud layer of the stack, or the SDDC layer of the stack, as well as the underlying infrastructure. So VMware has released these SDDC Manager APIs to help automate a lot of the SDDC Manager type of automation that would have been performed using the UI, but now can be performed using programmatic API calls. So this can be easily integrated with extensible third-party automation tooling or business systems. And we've been able to integrate some of these APIs to the specific operating model that exists with Cloud Foundation on Vxrail. So a good set of what APIs are supported with this can be found in the API reference guide for Cloud Foundation on Vxrail at the link provided on the slide. So what kind of APIs are supported? Well, ultimately, the APIs are kind of broken up into 4 major categories. You have infrastructure APIs, which handle infrastructure deployment and provisioning, configuration, and retirement. And then you have management APIs, which deal more with think of user accounts and other types of SDDC manager focused operations. Security APIs for things like permissions and password rotations and the like. And then finally, lifecycle APIs, being able to manage update packages and actually apply update bundles across the Cloud Foundation software and Vxrail HCI infrastructure using these API calls. Now, as far as introduction to some of those types of APIs that are new to VCF on Rail, the Cloud Foundation 4.0 API set of APIs includes a new API to support Nsxt stretch cluster execution. So in the past, in prior versions, you would use kind of some CLI commands with an SDDC manager SOS utility to execute this. And now we can actually execute this using an SDDC manager API in order to stretch these clusters. And then finally, to kind of wrap up some of the API topic here, if you want to be able to see all of those types of APIs and really look at that API reference guide within your SDDC manager admin console, there is now a new developer center menu option available within the VCF on VxRail kind of SDDC manager experience that allows you to explore all of these different API calls in a nice, easy to search index. It also provides some API code samples so that you can easily integrate them into your various business systems or higher order automation systems. So it's a good way to kind of even test out different API calls to see what the result would be. And this is something that you can reference within the SDDC manager user interface. So just making it nice and easy to adapt and adopt some of these new APIs into your management model. Okay, next topic is security. So in VCF 4.0, there has been some additional security enhancements, in particular, new role-based access control roles. In particular, one that was new is the operator role. So we've always had the admin role, which has all of the privileges available to that type of user. The operator role is new to this release, and it is available with really all the same privileges of an admin, except for the ability to do password management, the ability to perform any type of backup and restore operations, and the ability to handle any type of user management. So this is helpful as we start to really get more granular kind of security isolation capabilities within Cloud Foundation's management structure. The operator role is kind of that first attempt at this. These roles have been integrated with platform services controllers and Active Directory. And ultimately, for those that may be familiar with prior versions of Cloud Foundation, this ultimately will replace the privileged user account that was used in some instances for things like backup and restore operations and the like. So now the operator role is kind of what's being used for that. Now, we kind of mentioned the fact that we support APIs with SDDC Manager. It's also important to highlight the fact that there has been some security enhancements on using those APIs. And we now have token-based authentication when using SDDC Manager APIs. So this adds an extra layer of security on top of not only who can access the APIs, but whether they have permission to execute them. And a part of how this is checked is through the use of authentication tokens and tokens that have been given kind of the right permissions to execute these types of API calls. And these have also been integrated with Platform Services Controller and Active Directory integrations. So if you want to learn more around all of these kind of security functions around tokens, you can certainly refer to the Cloud Foundation documentation and you'll find a lot of information in there on this. All right, so we've talked a lot about the Cloud Foundation 4.0 software updates. Now let's kind of dive into some of the Vxrail platform highlights. So one of the things that's always been really important to understand with Cloud Foundation and Rail as a solution is the fact that we're able to leverage a lot of the native Vxrail platform capabilities within a Cloud Foundation on Vxrail deployment. And a lot of these capabilities include support to use the many different Vxrail platform models to align to the various application and infrastructure, compute, storage, and networking resource needs that our customers have. And so with Cloud Foundation 4.0, all of the various Vxrail hardware models that you see listed here, both across Flash, hybrid, and even NVMe-based models, are all supported. And along with these different types of models, we have a full, robust configure-to-order set of hardware configurations, into the hundreds of thousands by now, across many of these different categories of processor types and RAM configurations for memory, like I said before, with storage. And then networking, we've increased some of our support with this. Obviously, we are bound by some of the Cloud Foundation standardized architecture kind of guidelines around how Cloud Foundation requires networking to be configured from a host point of view. But for the most part, you kind of have a full open bag of configure-to-order options for your Vxrail nodes that are used. One important thing to note, though, on this, especially as it relates to the GPU. So Vxrail 7.0, which is based on Vsphere 7.0, was released within that 30-day kind of synchronous ship type of alignment that we have with VMware. By the time that Vxrail 7.0 was released, NVIDIA hadn't yet made available their GPU drivers for Vsphere 7. And so when we packaged up that release, we did not have those NVIDIA drivers available. And so right now, any of the NVIDIA GPUs are not currently supported with Vxrail 7.0 until the next version, when the next Vsphere update includes those drivers in it. So right now with Vsphere, with Cloud Foundation on Vxrail 7, the NVIDIA GPU support is not available, but will be planned for a future release once we get those drivers into the next Vxrail update. Now, I touched upon this idea of ensuring that the underlying infrastructure has to map to a supported Cloud Foundation architecture set of requirements. And we kind of define this as just being VCF compliant, which really is a definition of something that is a physical and logical Vxrail deployment configuration. That we need to make sure that when we deploy our Vxrails that are going to be used for Cloud Foundation, that they map to and support the supported hardware configuration requirements, as well as logical software configuration requirements that Cloud Foundation requires ultimately. And so part of what we have here is kind of updates to these requirements. Now that we support a consolidated architecture, we can start with a 4-node Vxrail cluster and deploy VCF on that, as opposed to what was a 7-node or 8-node minimum in the past. And now there's even been updates to our standardized architecture, which does require now a minimum of 7 nodes. However, 8 nodes is recommended, but that drop to support that minimum of 7 nodes is now in complete alignment to what you would find with Cloud Foundation anywhere else. And then finally, kind of these new changes to the 2 PNIC type of node configurations with that support for the converged VDS and Nsxt. So these are now kind of some of the bare minimums that you would have in order to run Cloud Foundation on Rail. All right, so the last section to cover here is in regards to some changes made to the licensing, the delivery for VCF on Rail as far as infrastructure delivery. some of the updates to some of our services, and different types of financial consumption updates. So let's talk about that. So with Cloud Foundation 4.0, VMware introduced new support for the Vsphere with Kubernetes. So they have licensed this Vsphere with Kubernetes as a Cloud Foundation Vsphere add-on for Kubernetes subscription license. This additional license is on top of the core VMware Cloud Foundation soft bundles that have already existed for some time. When I look to want to leverage this Vsphere with Kubernetes functionality, I have to purchase the Vsphere add-on for Kubernetes subscription service. And at this time, that subscription service is only available through VMware. So today, we've always had the ability for customers to bring their own Cloud Foundation licenses to Cloud Foundation on Vxrail. They could supply them from purchasing them from Dell EMC as an OEM or an EOEM license, along with the Vxrail infrastructure. So it makes it nice and easy to have a single vendor to procure all of this technology from. Or for customers that certainly have existing ELAs or want to work with a VMware reseller to purchase their licenses, they certainly could do that as well. It's just important to note that this Vsphere add-on for Kubernetes in Cloud Foundation is only available through VMware at this time. So what are some of the different types of Dell Technologies Cloud Platform infrastructure delivery options? Well, we've always had Vxrail be a HCI platform that can be delivered as a set of nodes, where customers have the complete flexibility to pick their own networking and integrate those Vxrail systems with their existing networking if they so choose, as well as being able to integrate these Vxrail systems into their own racks within their data center. However, we've certainly had a lot of demand over the past 12 to 18 months where customers want something even more turnkey. They would like to have their Vxrail systems delivered in a fully racked and stacked rack as part of the factory services that also includes networking. And so they want all of that pre-configured and then shipped in a rack to their data centers so that it's just easy to plug in and begin to start using that infrastructure. So the Dell Technologies Cloud Platform does have now support for being able to deliver this solution using Vxrail nodes, where it can be delivered into existing customer racks, and customers can choose to use their own network switches, or it can be delivered physically as a pre-integrated rack and stacked rack system that can be delivered with networking pre-cabled to the Vxrail nodes, and some of that internal kind of rack design effort be fully done as part of our factory services. No matter which type of delivery option you choose, your Cloud Foundation on Vxrail experience would be exactly the same. You have all of the integration that has been co-engineered into the solution available to you with things like automated lifecycle management for the full entire stack, including HCI hardware, right, through the integration that we've co-engineered. So that level of operating experience is no different. It's just a matter of what kind of physical packaging would you like delivered. Also new to this particular release and moving forward, one of the key value props of Cloud Foundation on Rail, aside from bring your own license and the technology integrations, is this availability to provide customers with a single source of break-fix support for the full stack. And that's through our Pro Support and Pro Support Plus Dell services offerings. One of the interesting things that has now kind of been released is a new dedicated Pro Support and Pro Support Plus for Cloud Foundation on Vxrail offerings, which not only entails the ability to support Cloud Foundation software, even if you purchase them outside of Dell EMC, but also the ability to include remote lifecycle management services so that our support teams, remote support teams, can upgrade your environment if you so choose. And then finally, one of the real important things to highlight, aside from all of the technology and things like that around the solution, is to also factor in that Dell Technologies is providing customers with choices in how they pay for their Dell Technologies cloud platform. Obviously, with a lot of traditional payment options, you always have a CapEx choice for being able to purchase the technology and get it implemented into your data center. And in this case, you certainly have this option built for kind of choice and flexibility to align to kind of what customers are looking to get accomplished. This would require an upfront payment, as most traditional CapExes would, and it supports really all of the different types of combinations of the Cloud Foundation on Vxrail product configurations, including Vxrail Platform node configure to order options. And then, like many other things, this is certainly a form of payment that is available globally, so something that everyone can take advantage of. However, the Dell Technologies Cloud Platform continues to innovate in how we can help customers really adopt that public cloud experience for hybrid cloud or private cloud infrastructure with the introduction last year to the Dell Technologies Cloud Platform subscription offering. So for those customers that want a form of payment that is built for speed and is really easy to consume, and who desires a kind of OpEx kind of consumption that has a subscription-based price that is per node, per month, that is always kind of consistent, then this is kind of the financial model available to you. This also enables us to deliver a full Dell Technologies Cloud Platform to your data center in the fastest time possible. A part of how this gets accomplished is by offering 6 pre-configured node options with the standard kind of pre-built racks. So you're kind of trading off some of the configured to order flexibility of hardware configurations and delivery with something that's a little bit more pre-packaged in order to speed up that initial delivery for you. In this case, this subscription offering is available only in the US today, with plans to expand it over time. And then finally, the other kind of model for consumption, instead of having this kind of fixed monthly payment based on the infrastructure I have, what if I wanted to pay for that technology based on the usage of that technology? So that if I had a spike only for a limited time in resource utilization, but for the most part, and below a certain resource utilization threshold, I really just want to pay for what I have been using versus having to buy up front enough resources to pay for the peak. And this is where the Dell Technologies on-demand portfolio of OpEx type of models come into play. So these choices are delivered through our Dell Financial Services arm, and is a complete consumption program that has multiple options in it, from flex on demand to data center utility to kind of traditional leasing. And in this case, you do have that flexibility of full configure to order configurations for the Cloud Foundation on Vxrail solution, and this is something that is available globally. So we kind of have that portfolio of financial consumption models along with these choices of technologies and so forth, because ultimately we look at customers adopting cloud as a combination of people, process, and technology. And so we need to make sure that we align to all of these different people areas and financial business model areas on top of providing best of breed technology to do it. And so really that kind of covers what I wanted to highlight as far as anything that's new. I think right now we have about 5 minutes remaining before the top of the hour. So I will hand it back to our moderator and see where you want to take it from here. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Jason, for taking the time to speak to us today. As a reminder to the audience, you will receive a follow-up email with the on-demand link from today's webcast. To find out more about the VMUG webcast program, visit vmug.com and check out the education page. Please make sure to complete the short online evaluation as you exit the webcast to be entered into the Nintendo Switch Lite giveaway. And from all of us here at VMUG, thank you and have a great rest of your day.